looks okay. We'll see. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Good. Nice to see you all. Welcome also to everyone watching online. We have a lot of great questions as always. Let me just make sure this stream is going okay. Looks okay. This one. Stream is healthy. That's what it says. Okay. So we can, we'll, as always, we'll take questions both from our online students and local students. We'll start here. First question is from Gayatri. Gayatri asks, Gayatri has been deeply involved studying Vedanta, and she asks, but it seems like I have hit a plateau. Might sound familiar to many, and for a lot of us that are learning through YouTube, Vedanta books, etc., we have no access to an enlightened guru in person. Are we just stuck in this birth? First, just before we get into the details, no access to an enlightened guru in person. That idea of being in person, I think, is perhaps a misnomer. If the internet existed 2,000 years ago, do you think the rishis would have used it? Extensively. So, you know, this idea of personal and online, I think we need not feel too rigid about that. The importance is having good guidance, but I think the deeper issue, that's a kind of a surface level issue, the deeper issue Gayatri faces is early on, there might seem to be more progress in your sadhana, your spiritual practice. And then after a while, and I think in her case after 2 decades, that progress may seem to slow down. So that's what we want to address here in particular. And that's not uncommon. In fact, I would say that's extremely common for a number of reasons. And, you know, to explore the particular obstacles that Gayatri or any individual person faces, I think obstacles vary a lot from person to person. But in my experience teaching over all these years, is the main obstacle is waiting to discover some little tidbit, some little teaching in Advaita Vedanta's opus, in all of its works. Some little teaching that you haven't yet heard and you're waiting to hear that. It's an assumption many people have. I'm not enlightened yet. It means I haven't heard the right teaching yet. If I just go on listening longer, sooner or later, if I have a proper teacher, sooner or later I will hear that missing teaching, the missing link, we can call it. There's no missing link. For almost all of you watching this satsang, attending this satsang, for almost all of you, let me rephrase it. If you have been engaged seriously in these teachings of Advaita Vedanta for as long as Gayatri, 10 or 20 years, and if you have been properly taught, if you have properly understood, I guarantee you, and I'm saying this very emphatically, I guarantee you there's nothing that you missed. There's no missing link. There's nothing to wait for. You have already been taught everything you need. I'll say that again. You've already been taught everything you need to become enlightened. Then what's the problem? And the problem has to do with the very subtle way that Vedanta works. We've had this discussion several times of how Advaita Vedanta is not a subject matter like any other subject matter. You don't study Vedanta and become enlightened. Let me put it in bolder terms. Vedanta won't make you enlightened. A teacher of Vedanta, including me, can't make you enlightened. Enlightenment means discovering your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. That discovery of the truth of who you already are, that discovery is a goal, and no one can do it for you. The teachings of Vedanta can't make you discover your true self. I can't make you discover your true self. You have to do it. No one can do it for you. The purpose of these teachings, please remember, the purpose of these teachings is to guide your personal practice of Atma Vichara, self-inquiry. And you've already understood enough Vedanta for that practice of Atma Vichara to be successful. So, where is the problem? Most of the time, the problem is in that process of self-inquiry. In particular, you're not doing it. You're listening to Vedanta. Listening to Vedanta is not self-inquiry. Listening to me, watching my videos, reading other books, watching other videos, none of that is self-inquiry. I'm being a little hyped up here because this is a big issue, so allow me to be a little hyped up. And I interrupted myself.
The importance of self-awareness.
Thank you. Okay. So, to listen, to study Vedanta is not self-inquiry. When does self-inquiry take place? Well, that depends. It depends a lot on person to person. For some people, self-inquiry can take place during a class. Not always, but can. I'll give you, a funny memory I have. If you listen with the right orientation, that is, as you hear the Guru speaking the words, if you immediately use those words to look within yourself right there and then, not later, but during the class. You can do it. It has some interesting consequences. When I was studying with my Guru, Puja Swami Tadatmananda, back in 1980s, I was one of those students who would always sit right in front. And I'm sharing that for a particular purpose, because sometimes as he would talk, I would be so engaged in the self-inquiry that I'd close my eyes, which doesn't look good if you're sitting in the front row. Guru will assume you're sleeping. But that's what happened. I would be so introspective during the class that I would close my eyes. That's self-inquiry. Now, it doesn't need to be during class, but you need to do it. I would say the best advice I can give for shifting, let me try these words, to shift your focus from consuming Vedanta. What a nice expression. Wow. I've never used that term. Instead of consuming more and more Vedanta, do more Atma Vichara, more self-inquiry. You've already consumed enough Vedanta. What's missing is more self-inquiry. And a very practical advice for doing that more is more meditation. If you are studying Vedanta for 2 hours a day and meditating twice a week, the ratio is way off, completely off. So meditation, not meditation in a mechanical way. Let me refine this. Meditation, in a formal sense, is used to prepare you for self-inquiry, to make your mind ready for this deep inquiry. So if you're not doing meditation, you're depriving yourselves of opportunities for self-inquiry. So I would highly, highly recommend, if you don't already have a very consistent, well-developed practice of meditation, start there. After your practice of meditation is better developed, then every day sit down, meditate for a while, and then, without getting up from the seat, start to use these teachings to look within yourself for the sake of understanding, who am I, what's going on? The best, if you're not doing it during class, and I have a feeling most students don't, I was kind of the oddball back in those days. So if you're not doing this self-inquiry during class, make an opportunity happen. And the opportunity I would suggest is immediately after meditating. So first meditate, then Atma Vichara, self-inquiry. Okay, that's an excellent question. Let's take some more here. This question comes from Ravi, who lives in Chennai. He's asking, in a prior session, I had said, a spiritual solution will not solve an emotional problem any more than an emotional solution will solve a spiritual problem. And he says, well, I understand the second part of your statement, that an emotional solution will not solve a spiritual problem. He finds a problem with the first part of the statement, a spiritual solution will not solve an emotional problem. And I think the problem, pardon me for using the word, the problem here is actually my language. Instead of saying a spiritual solution will not solve an emotional problem, that term emotional problem is too broad. Suppose, and I misspoke. Usually when I teach this, I don't say emotional problem. I usually say, and I should have said, a spiritual solution will not solve a psychological problem. And there's a big difference between a psychological problem and an emotional problem. Emotional problem, we're all experts in emotional problems. I don't have to tell you what are emotional problems. A psychological problem, though, is something else. Let's take a serious psychological problem like schizophrenia, which is surprisingly common. I mean, shockingly common, like 1 in 100 common, something like that. And of course, there are degrees of severity of schizophrenia, but it can lead to psychosis, where you hallucinate and you lose contact with reality, and your thinking becomes very based on fantasy. It's a serious illness, and if you know anyone who's struggling with it, you've discovered that it's bad. So let me rephrase and say, spiritual solution will not solve a psychological problem. Will it take care of emotional problems? Probably, unless some emotional problems have a deep psychological component, right? You can have an emotional problem that is, say you have a problem with low self-esteem that's rooted in the fact that you're also suffering from depression and bipolar disorder and this and that and the other thing. So emotional problems and psychological problems are often interrelated. But for the sake of our discussion today, let's kind of separate them. Enlightenment will free you from all ordinary emotional problems. Ordinary emotional problems. That is, emotional problems that don't have a psychological illness component. But the fact is, many emotional problems do have a component of psychological illness associated with it. And it's pretty obvious enlightenment is not going to remove someone's schizophrenia. It's an organic problem in the brain. So Vedanta will not solve a significant psychological problem like schizophrenia. These teachings can indeed help you overcome many, as I said, normal, ordinary emotional problems, absolutely. And that's kind of the point that Ravi is making here. But let me make it very clear that if that emotional problem is strongly connected to a form of psychological illness, it's a wrong expectation that Vedantic self-inquiry or enlightenment would remove psychological illness. Would Vedanta remove physical illness? Then why should we imagine that Vedanta would remove psychological illness? You know, I'm presuming all of you are up to date, so to speak, and that is, in the last 100 years ago, there were a lot of other theories about mental illness. Today, we know very well that all forms of psychological illness are rooted in the function of your brain. It's not, 100 years ago, people thought of it as weakness of character. No professional thinks that today. So, psychological problems have an organic basis. Psychological illness has an organic basis in your brain, and that will not be directly addressed through Vedanta. Okay, you'll need the microphone.
Yeah. So if someone has clinical depression or anxiety, will that be a psychological problem? And in that case, if it is yes.
Depression is psychological illness.
Right. So if it is yes, then...
clinical depression.
Right, clinical depression.
Make
yes.
clear.
Yeah. So clinical depression is a psychological problem, then...
Psychological illness.
Then if you are on the spiritual path and engaged in spiritual activities, including meditation, that helps. I thought that helps somewhat handling or managing the...
Helps manage the symptoms, absolutely. What I said is it doesn't solve the problem.
Okay.
So, first, let's be very clear. For someone who is struggling with psychological illness, by the way, I think if I remember right, the statistics are 1 out of 3 people in their lifetimes will experience some kind of psychological illness. Not emotional problem, 100% emotional problems, but psychological illness. 1 out of 3. Now, does it mean, the point to be made here in response to Pinky's question is a life of sadhana, spiritual practice, can certainly empower you to deal with psychological illness more gracefully. Just like sadhana can help you deal with physical illness more gracefully. Will the sadhana cure the physical illness? No. In the same way, sadhana can help you deal with psychological illness more gracefully. Doesn't cure it, but you can handle it more gracefully. Good. Next discussion. Next question from Maya, who lives in Singapore. Question about japa and prayer to ishta. Ishta, devata, is your chosen form of Bhagavan, some aspect of God that you have chosen for the sake of your prayer and worship. And her question here is how to establish an emotional relationship with that deity that you don't see with your eyes. So suppose you're devoted to Lord Krishna or Lord Shiva. Have you ever met? No, but how to develop an emotional relationship with a deity that you have never met. It's interesting how the fact is that people develop emotional relationships all the time to people they've never met. I mean, this whole this Hollywood Bollywood thing. Actors. People develop really deep emotional feelings towards certain actors. Have you ever met them? No. Or people, this is little, I don't want to get into a discussion on this, but people also end up having very strong emotional relationships with certain political leaders, both positive and negative. Have you ever met Donald Trump? But you probably have an emotional response, whether it's positive or negative, I don't care. But without meeting a person, definitely you can have an emotional connection, an emotional relationship. So if that's true for actors in Hollywood and Bollywood, why should it not be true for forms of Ishvara? Lack of personal contact is no impediment to developing a deep relationship. Developing a deep relationship with any form of Ishvara depends on you. Ishvara doesn't have to appear before you in a certain form. It's up to you to develop that relationship. And it doesn't, anyway, not dependent on that. Next question here from Arun, who lives in Bangalore. He has a problem with there's a verse in chapter 8 of the Bhagavad Gita. Anta kale cha mam eva. Sri Krishna says that one who remembers me at the end of their life, in their dying moments, that person is guaranteed to come to me. Arun reads this, and not surprising, he says he has some doubts about this. Good. You should have some doubts about this. It means you're paying attention. Let me make a joke, not a joke out of this, but a kind of a sarcastic observation. If somebody tells you that if you think of Sri Krishna at the moment of death, you will go to Krishna Loka, guaranteed. If your response is, ha, Haji, if that's your response, that is blind faith. And that kind of blind faith, in my opinion, can be a huge obstacle for people on the path of Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta is not based on blind faith, and blind faith can actually create problems. So instead of blind faith, we need some critical thinking. There's nothing to be afraid of. Interesting, just an interesting observation. Most other religions are afraid of critical thinking. Not here. In fact, critical thinking is encouraged in this tradition. So, to come to Arun's question, there's a problem with scriptural interpretation. He understands it. He says, when the body is at an active stage of dying, struggling to survive, then what is the likelihood that a jiva can remember Ishvara? Moreover, some people even slip into a coma and die without having any thoughts whatsoever. All of which is absolutely true. So this is critical thinking. This is good. But it does show a problem with scriptural interpretation. First of all, the obvious observation is whenever you take a scriptural statement out of context, the meaning gets distorted. So in order to answer this question, you can't just look at one verse in chapter 8. You have to, first of all, you have to study all of chapter 8. To understand all of chapter 8, you have to study the whole Bhagavad Gita. To understand the whole Bhagavad Gita, you have to study lots and lots and lots, which means to properly interpret any scriptural statement requires lots of background, lots of deep understanding. Without going through lots of details here, simply put, chapter 8 mostly describes a yogi who dies, not an ordinary person, but a great yogi who dies can undergo certain practices as they die, including dying with complete alertness, with your attention focused on God. There's a whole process of guiding your spirit out through your Brahmarandra, this opening in the back of the head. This is all described in surprising detail in chapter 8, how a great yogi dies. Are you a great yogi? I'm not. I don't think I'll die like that. I'm hoping I'll die in a morphine daze. To me, that sounds like the best way to go. No pain, just kind of nice. Anyway, if I'm in a morphine daze, I'm not going to be thinking about Sri Krishna. So, if you study all of chapter 8, Sri Krishna basically gives you a choice. And that is, one, you can be a great yogi and die in this very deliberate, conscious way, or you can take the easy way, my way. And Sri Krishna says, you just surrender to me, as a kind of language he uses. So recognizing that we can't all be great yogis, especially at the moment of death, but that's not the only way to die. So this is a common confusion. Chapter 8 is often misunderstood like that. Because of this, people don't get it. That most of chapter 8 doesn't describe an ordinary person at the time of death, but describes a great yogi, an unusual person. Okay, let's take one more question here, and then let's see if there are other questions. Okay, a question for Satsang. This comes from Jairaj. Jairaj lives in London. Welcome. Jairaj asks about Advaita Vedanta and the confluence with analytic idealism of Bernardo Kastrup. Okay. My question for Satsang is, what are the parallels between Advaita Vedanta and modern scientific philosophies of consciousness, specifically the analytic idealism proposed by Bernardo Kastrup? Now, this Kastrup is kind of a modern phenomenon, and yes, I have I'm not an expert at all in what he teaches, but I've exposed myself enough to his teachings to get the general sense. He's part of a kind of a rebellious group of philosophers who are highly influenced by non-dualistic teachings. I'm not saying that Bernardo Kastrup has studied Advaita Vedanta, but his thinking is highly influenced by Advaitic teachings. Yeah, I don't think he has studied Upanishads and other teachings of Advaita Vedanta, but what he says, what he teaches, reflects much of those teachings. So now, the number, it's quite a long email here. What are your views on the value of such independent, scientifically slanted philosophies? This is a big topic. Let me try to focus on one or two very specific points. The goal of a philosopher like Kastrup is very different from the goal of a Advaita Vedantin, like, say, Shankaracharya. Because Advaita Vedanta is not philosophy, as we've discussed many, many times. So the goal of Advaita Vedanta is to remove suffering, simply put. Would you say the goal of philosophy is to remove suffering? Philosophers wouldn't say that.
We understand.
So we begin by acknowledging the fact that Advaita Vedanta and philosophy are both pursuits of truth, but motivated by very different reasons. Advaita Vedanta pursues truth for the sake of solving the problem of suffering. By the way, most philosophies don't deal with suffering at all, and not to speak of consciousness, which is the nature of non-dual consciousness, is a main theme of this Bernardo Kastrup's teachings, and very similar. What he teaches has lots in common with Advaita Vedanta. But his perspective is not to solve the problem of suffering. His perspective is to find out what is consciousness. He wants to know what is consciousness. Okay. Go for it. Sorry, I'm being a little facetious here. My point is, after you know the nature of consciousness, then what? Then you learn the nature of nothingness. Then learn the nature of this and that and the other thing. The point is that this kind of philosophical knowledge, understanding of what it is utterly different than Advaita Vedanta. A philosopher would say, like Kastrup, would say, what is consciousness? An Advaita Vedantin, one who understands a little better, would say, instead of saying, what is consciousness, the question is, who am I? How different those questions are. What is consciousness is a philosophical inquiry. Who am I is a deeply personal inquiry. We just got done talking about Atma Vichara. Now, it's possible that Kastrup is kind of investigating some of these more Vedantic kinds of teachings, but his starting point is so different from Vedanta's starting point. And I can't help but feel that it makes a big difference. If your starting point is wanting to know what is consciousness, or if your starting point is wanting to know who am I can't help but feel that the starting point makes a big, big difference. Now, one final point here. Jairaj says that he finds a lot of value in the teachings of Kastrap. He says for the sake of his manana, it's giving him a kind of intellectual certainty. I would say if it works for you, Jairaj, good for you. I think most people would feel a little intimidated by Kastrap's work. If you want, go look at it, and he is up there. His intellect is really up there, and you have to come up to that level to really understand. If teachings like this truly help you in your self-inquiry, and I'm a little doubtful about that, but suppose his teachings truly helped you in your process of, in your practice of self-inquiry, I would say, excellent, go for it. I'm afraid, however, that it's easy to fall, and I'm not saying that Jairaj is making this mistake, but let me just point out a possible problem, and that is to look for validation of what Vedanta teaches in science. Why? That means if you find a need, and I'm not saying Jairaj feels like this, what I am saying, if a person feels like the teachings of Advaita Vedanta are not adequate, are not sufficient, and therefore goes outside of the teachings of Advaita Vedanta to analytic, what is it called? Analytic idealism. Good. If you go outside to this analytic idealism because you feel like Advaita Vedanta is insufficient, the problem in my mind is you haven't understood Advaita Vedanta properly. If you really get the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, they don't need external validation from analytic idealism or from anywhere else. But again, if it helps you, then that's good. If it becomes a distraction, that's another thing entirely. Okay, do we have any questions here today? In back? You need the microphone, please.
Thank you. Namaste, Swamiji. I have a question about Maya. Advaita says that the ultimate truth, the ultimate existence is Brahman. Everything else is Maya. So I'm just wondering if Maya here means something of transient or temporary existence.
Sure.
So this is a way of for us to understand that even if we live for 120 years, it's just minuscule compared to the eternal timeline of the universe or existence.
That's all correct.
So we can decide about our own suffering, our own feelings in terms of yes, it's important, but it's not the only thing, not the permanent thing.
So the distinction Vedanta wants to make here is that your essence is eternal and unchanging. Therefore, whatever changes doesn't affect you. You are unchanging. Body goes on changing, but you, as pure consciousness, don't undergo any change. That's the nature of the distinction. So in other words, it's not a philosophical distinction. There is a philosophical difference, but the point is that if your true nature is unchanging consciousness that can't be affected by anything that happens to your body, anything that happens to your mind, anything that happens in your environment. If your true nature is unchanging consciousness, then you need not feel threatened by anything at all. That's kind of the point.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question here.
Swami, this is about Ishvara and Brahman. Can Brahman exist without Ishvara? Are they codependent? And second part to that is it almost like when we are asleep and someone calls out our name we don't know? Is that how we think of Ishvara's relationship with Brahman?
Okay, that's the relationship between Ishvara and Brahman. Are they codependent? That sounds like a rather philosophical question, just to relate to what we're talking about here. So let me try to stay on this theme of Atma Vichara and address your question is very philosophical. And I've just spent a half an hour talking about how very philosophical inquiries are not necessarily helpful. So let me try to kind of redirect your question in this way. For someone engaged in a practice of self-inquiry, trying to discover the truth of themselves so that they can be free from suffering, what is Brahman and what is Ishvara from that standpoint? Now notice I'm rephrasing it to put it in a non-philosophical framework, good situation. So let us set philosophy aside and say, what does it mean to me? So what it means to me is my true nature as unchanging consciousness. That's Brahman. There's no difference between unchanging consciousness and Brahman. They're different descriptions that fit into different applications, different perspectives. If we're talking about your essential nature, pure consciousness, Atma. If we're talking about the essential nature of everything that exists, the underlying reality because of which everything exists, we'll use the term Brahman. But obviously, the reality because of which everything exists and the reality because of which you exist cannot be two different things. There is one reality because of which you exist, because of which I exist, because of which the universe exists. We call that one reality Brahman or Atma, depending on context. That's Brahman. And that also shows how the word Brahman fits into self-inquiry. How is Brahman known? This is very important. You will never understand Brahman by looking outside, trying to discover the reality because of which everything exists. It's not out there, waiting to be discovered. Brahman is not one of many things out there in the universe. So then how can Brahman be discovered? Through self-inquiry. By turning your attention within to discover your true nature as pure consciousness, and then, with the help of Vedantic teachings, to realize that pure consciousness cannot be distinguished from Brahman. But the discovery is inside. The discovery of Brahman is not in Vedanta books. The discovery of Brahman is not in... The discovery of Brahman is inside. Now, Ishvara. Ishvara is meaningful when you don't know that your true nature is Atma, which is identical to Brahman. That is, Ishvara is meaningful for an unenlightened person. If you know my true nature is Brahman, then you won't even ask about Ishvara. You won't need to ask about Ishvara. But the fact is, everyone who's watching this satsang not enlightened. Therefore, Ishvara becomes extremely important in terms of prayer life. Now notice, Ishvara is whom you pray to. You have a relationship with the intelligent creator because of whom you exist, because of whom everything exists. That personal relationship cannot be with Brahman. You have no person. Brahman is non-relational. There's no relationships possible. You have a relationship with Brahman. You have a relationship with Ishvara, pardon me. So, notice this response to your question, which is probably not a satisfying response at all. But what I'm doing is recasting the discussion to put it on the platform of personal spiritual practice and to remove it from the realm of philosophical debate. Now, if we want to be philosophers, I'll end by answering your question in a philosophical way. What is the relationship between Brahman and Ishvara? Ishvara has form, creator, sustainer, not just physical form, being attributes, creator, sustainer, destroyer, etc. Karma pala data, the intelligence that makes the entire universe go. Ishvara is a conscious being with infinite power and infinite intelligence. You are a limited being with limited power and limited intelligence. Ishvara is the infinite version of that. You exist because of Atma. Brahman exists because of, Ishvara exists because of, and call it Atma, call it Brahman, same thing. The relationship between consciousness and you is the relationship between Brahman and Ishvara. Ishvara exists having Brahman as its underlying reality. Now, that's a philosophical standpoint. Now you're satisfied. Yes, now I understand the relationship between Brahman and Ishvara, but sorry, I'm stuck on this point. So what? And please don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to be critical, but so much of our discussion so far this morning has to do with our I'm as guilty of this as anyone else when I was young, and that is over-intellectualizing the teachings of Vedanta. It is, if there is a huge obstacle to Advaita Vedanta really working, it's this. We over-intellectualize it. If we shift, just to rephrase what I said before, if we shift our orientation away from what is consciousness, who is Ishvara, what is Brahman, if we shift the focus to who am I, those questions will eventually get answered. But they'll be answered through a process of self-inquiry, which I'm convinced is 1,000 times more effective than this more conventional philosophical approach to Advaita Vedanta. So, enough said. Let's take several more questions before we conclude. Next question here from Chetna. Chetna she lives in, where did it say here? Chetna lives in Houston. And she says she's in her early 20s and feels that, my question is, how does one keep, by the way, Chetna is a girl's name? I think so, right? Yeah. In Sanskrit, it's neuter in gender. So, anyway, that's something else. Okay. How does one keep fighting for dharma both externally and internally. Maybe it's because I'm only in my early 20s, but so much of the world feels hopeless, and a dharma seems to run rampant. How can I better understand Advaita Vedanta to fight off those creeping feelings of nihilism? Excellent. Wow, good question. Okay. Definitely, I think we all get Chaitana's feeling about things going out of whack today. Definitely, adharma is just going nuts. Definitely true. How does one keep fighting for dharma? It's obvious that if you get overwhelmed by pessimism and depression, there's plenty to be depressed about, I get that. But if you're overwhelmed by pessimism and depression, does that make you better equipped or less well equipped to deal with the problems that we face today? So, the role of spiritual practice in general, and Advaita Vedanta in particular, is to give you some resiliency. Resiliency in the sense that you know that your true nature is Satchidananda Atma, pure, unchanging consciousness. You're okay no matter what. To the degree that these Vedantic teachings go in, to that degree, the world becomes less threatening. I don't mean that the world becomes a wonderful, friendly place. I just mean you won't be threatened by it so much. Not feeling threatened by it so much will actually make you better able to deal with it in a more effective way, including to address problems of adharma. So spiritual practice in general can help in that way. Interesting question from Amit, who lives in India. I'll paraphrase this. He has met two young friends in their 30s. He says one belongs to the sakshi bhava group, and the other belongs to the anti-sakshi bhava group. What is a sakshi bhava group? First of all, sakshi bhava is actually used to describe a meditation practice in which you distance yourself from the activities of your mind and you become a passive, detached observer of the activities of your mind. It's a meditation practice. But Amit observes that he has one friend in the Sakshi Bhava camp who apparently is a follower of Osho, Rajneesh. Difficult. Okay. And according to this person, his goal is to always remain in the Sakshi Bhava, to always be an observer, a detached observer. Amit says that he spends his whole day in the park just doing that. Sits on a park bench and just observes. Doesn't he have anything better to do? It's a meditation practice. It's not meant, and this is actually a serious issue. Some people misinterpret spiritual teachings in such a way where they think that the goal is to become permanently detached from life. You become a passive observer, always detached, so that nothing will bother you, nothing will affect you. You'll be surprised to know that this can be diagnosed as a form of psychological illness. Really. Not to choose to be in that state, but to choicelessly be detached from the world around you. is a pathology. It's a form of mental illness. The goal of spiritual life cannot be to be removed from life. What happens to intimacy? What happens to love and compassion? What happens to concern about adharma? That's not the goal. So let's be very clear. Sakshi bhava is a meditation technique. It has never been intended that you always remain as a detached observer to whatever's happening in your life. Then he talks about another friend who's in the anti-Sakshi Bhava camp. What does that mean? He says a guy puts down everything having to do with religion, satsang, enlightenment. They're all traps, conditioned, created by the mind. Okay, if he wants to have that perspective, that's up to him. He says that real life is not about escapism. So I think Amit's point is that these two people are really diametrically opposed. So one wants to detach himself from the world so that he doesn't suffer, and the other calls it escapism. But the one who calls it escapism doesn't just put down Sakshi Bhava, puts down all kinds of religion and spirituality. So he's gone off on another extreme. So one is taking the extreme of detachment, and the other is taking the extreme of materialism, realism. And extremes are never healthy. So does the truth lie someplace in the middle? There's a problem with this. If you have one statement that's wrong, and you have another statement that's wrong, do you really want to find someplace in the middle? I don't think that's well advised. Okay. Let's see. A question from Jayant, who lives in India. Jayant suffers from epilepsy. He has had no seizures for 3 years, taking medications for that. But apparently it looks like he is still quite young, living at home with his parents. His parents are looking to find him a partner for marriage, an arranged marriage. His parents want to hide his condition so that he can get married. This is a very typical Indian situation. Those of you who weren't raised if you don't understand Indian culture, this was a real eye-opener to me when I understood how all this happened. Very often, a young person with any significant mental or physical problem, those problems will intentionally be hidden for the sake of getting that person married. And then after they get married, of course, the problems come out and it's a mess. Now, parents want to hide this condition for the sake of getting their child married. We can understand the anxiety of the parents. Naturally, they'll feel anxious. They're concerned for the welfare of their son. But obviously, to hide truth in a way that causes harm is adharma. It's not harmless. It causes harm. And so he says there's an ethical point for any person in general who faces such a dilemma. Here's the issue. I would say the issue is less about it's less about being honest. The issue is more about not causing harm. That's the bottom line, not causing harm. Okay, we'll just take one more question here. This question comes from Aditya, who lives in Los Angeles. Growing up in a Hindu household, with Hindu views of morality, I experience a conflict with eating meat. I eat every kind of meat, mostly because I'm interested in trying foods from all around the world. Los Angeles, like New Jersey, is a melting pot, cultural melting pot. So you get foods and cultures from all over the world. I find it very difficult to give up eating meat, but at the same time I realize that it brings suffering to animals. I'm not sure if this is an impediment in my journey in Vedanta. I appreciate your advice. Is eating meat an impediment to enlightenment? You can answer that question, right? Getting enlightened is not what you eat. There's a nice video. You can watch that video on this particular topic. So what you eat has nothing to do at all with getting enlightened and practice of Atma Vichara, etc. Choosing not to eat meat is done specifically in the practice of ahimsa, harmlessness. Someone who develops a value for not causing harm, not just to human beings, but to, when you extend that value for not causing harm, you extend it to not causing harm to animals, you extend it to not causing harm to plants and trees, you extend it to not harming nature, the planet on which we live. So this is a particular spiritual practice, to cultivate a value for ahimsa, non-injury, and to put that value into practice in your daily choices and activities. It is a spiritual practice. It's not the only spiritual practice. It's not the main spiritual practice. Any kind of spiritual practice is helpful. To practice ahimsa in this way is helpful. But if you don't practice it, you're missing out on one of many kinds of spiritual practice. So, to practice ahimsa is wonderful, but is it a requirement for becoming enlightened or studying Vedanta? Absolutely not. Okay. I think this is a good place to conclude. Excellent questions. You can send your questions to me by email, and we'll take them up in our next session. We'll end with a prayer. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramaya Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.